We're in the home stretch of election season with just 2 months left before we all vote. Now, I learned a lot of really interesting stuff about this election when I was preparing for last week's video on polling, so we're going to continue with that topic this week. Specifically, we're going to look at what states ended up being swing states in 2016. Then we're going to talk about what are the most likely contenders for being swing states in 2020. All right, let's get to it. If you haven't watched last week's video, I highly recommend that you go back and do so. We talked a lot about how to read and utilize polls without getting a distorted view of the race. We also talked about what we're seeing in polls and whether or not we should believe that Biden is doing as well as they suggest that he is. To summarize, Americans like Biden a lot more than they liked Clinton, and there are a lot fewer undecided voters in 2020 than there were in 2016. But let's look at what that map looked like back in 2016, specifically at what the swing states were. In 2016, the swing states that got all the attention were Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, mostly because up until that point, they had been Democratic strongholds and Trump put them in play. After the election, we were inundated with stories about economic anxiety, theory that I never really bought into. It's even harder to buy into that now that we're seeing all these boat rallies and the Trump truck rallies filled with $100,000 trucks. I don't know if I see a whole lot of economic anxiety there, but be that as it may, he did put them in play, and it's worth looking at what happened there. First, we have Michigan. Trump won that by 11,000 votes, a very slim margin. Then there's Minnesota, which Clinton won by 45,000 votes. In Wisconsin, Trump won by 23,000 votes. And then he won Pennsylvania by 45,000 votes. These states aren't all that dissimilar, so we're seeing the kind of razor's edge that we're working with here. Then, just like in every modern presidential election, Florida was very close in 2016. Trump won Florida by just 113,000 votes. Florida went on to agitate Democrats in 2018, where it looked like they might have a shot at some congressional races and even the governorship, but they lost both of those. Then Clinton in 2016 won Nevada by just 27,000 votes. People like to compare Florida and Nevada because they both have large Hispanic and elderly populations, although it's worth noting that Florida in general is much more conservative than Nevada is, and their Hispanic population has a much larger Cuban portion than Nevada does. And finally, we have little old New Hampshire, which went for Clinton by a mere 2,700 votes. So in total, we have 7 states. They accounted for a grand total of 265,000 votes that decided the election. 190,000 of them went for Trump. They were the difference between a Trump presidency and a Clinton presidency. And I would be remiss here if I didn't mention that those 190,000 votes invalidated the 2 million more people that voted for Clinton than Trump across the nation, which just goes to show that the Electoral College is very, very stupid. So these were the swing states in 2016, but will they be the swing states in 2020? The polling data in each state gives us a little bit of an idea, but keep in mind that just because states are polling closely right now, that doesn't mean that they will end up being a swing state on election day. But let's take a look at the polls and see which ones are most likely to turn bright purple after we all vote. The first thing that I find interesting about these states is how many of them are in the South. First, we have Georgia. Georgia has been polling close all year. Right now, Trump is ahead of Biden by just 1.5 points. Then there's North Carolina. North Carolina is basically the opposite of Georgia. There, Biden is ahead of Trump by 1.4 points. Believe it or not, we also have Texas. Texas has been looking like it's going to trend more and more purple for a few election cycles now, but things really came to a head in 2018 when Democrats came within striking distance of really important congressional races. And now Trump leads Biden there by only 0.8 points. Last in the South, of course, is Florida. Again, Florida's a pretty tough one to gauge. Biden is ahead by 2.7 points right now, but that race does seem to be tightening a little bit. Florida recently voted to enfranchise the votes of Floridians who previously were convicted of felonies but have served their time. It's really hard to gauge where these voters will vote and how much their turnout will be, but there are some demographic markers that suggest they might be more likely to lean Democratic. That being said, Florida makes it pretty tough to vote in general. There's also a large Cuban population in Florida, which voted 54% for Trump in 2016, whereas 62% of Hispanic voters overall voted for Clinton in 2016. So they seem to buoy his numbers there a little bit. Either way, I feel pretty confident saying that this one will be close on election day. Then there's the last swing state left in the Rust Belt, Ohio, where Trump is ahead by only 0.9 points. And then there's Iowa, where he's ahead by just 1.6 points. You might notice that the rest of the Midwest is missing, but that's because Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, they're all 5 to 7 points in Biden's favor. So barring a polling error, they're not going to be swing states. And it looks like Biden has an opportunity to win that stronghold back. It's also worth mentioning here that if Trump doesn't win at least one of those 4 states, it might mean that all of the other swing states that we've mentioned don't matter. It's going to be really hard for him to win without any of those 4 states. It means that he'd have to pull off a win in Arizona and then probably flip another state that doesn't really look like it's going to vote red right now. And here I would like to point out an NBC poll of 2016 third-party voters that came out last week. It showed that 47% of them now support Biden, with 20% of them supporting Trump, and 33% of them unsure. The disclaimer here is that the sample size was pretty small, and those numbers can be shaky with that many unsure voters. But if those numbers would have broken that way in 2016, Clinton would have won handily. And if they hold up this time around, it would explain why all of those 2016 swing states have leaned in favor of Biden. I'll close this out by saying that all of this can be rendered moot this week when new polls come out, because last week, there were some recordings released of interviews that journalist Bob Woodward has been doing with Trump over the last 8 months. And they revealed that Trump knew how dangerous COVID-19 was from the jump and lied to us in order to try to manipulate our reaction to the pandemic. Now, these polling numbers have been really steady ever since June, but this is the kind of development that could move them. And we've learned in this video and in last that small shifts in voting totals can result in big shifts in electoral college votes. Nate Silver recently tweeted out these win probabilities for Biden using his forecasting models and different popular vote outcomes. So right now, Biden is 7.6 points ahead of Trump nationally. If he got hit with a 3-point polling error and ended up winning by only 4.6% in the popular vote, he would have an 89% chance of winning, according to Silver's forecasting model. If he got hit with a 4-point polling error, he'd be down to 75% chances of winning. I'm only bringing this up to say that if these new revelations push his popular vote win even by 1 or 2 points, his chances of getting hit with a major polling error that significantly reduces his chances of winning go down by a lot. So these could actually matter quite a bit. Thanks for watching this video. I'm really enjoying making these polling videos. If you like watching them, let me know and I'll try to make some more. Before I go, I want to switch gears just a little bit. I record these on Saturdays. So yesterday was 9/11. And 9/11 is obviously always pretty tough. It was one of the most tragic days in American history. But I couldn't help but find myself comparing it to the pandemic. 3,000 Americans died on 9/11, and it was rightfully, universally seen as unacceptable. 200,000 Americans have died in this pandemic, and frankly, it's just not being taken as seriously. One of the reasons for that is, if you think back to 9/11, we had all the 9/11 truthers that came out of that, the conspiracy theorists who tried to tell us that 9/11 was an inside job. Well, those same people during the pandemic, they're in the government. Our own president is trying to tell us that the pandemic was an inside job. It's completely unacceptable. We can't afford to let that to continue to happen. Also, if you look behind me, you'll notice that my view is a little bit different this weekend. And that's because the city is covered in a cloud of smoke as a result of the devastating wildfires that have hit the West Coast for yet another year. These disasters are becoming more and more common. It feels like we have a 9/11 a couple times a year now, and we can't get normalized to it. And we certainly can't keep electing people who don't take this stuff seriously. So I don't know. Vote. Just vote. Let's make these polling numbers a reality. Thanks. Like, subscribe, share. We'll see you next week.